In the spring of 1892, in Harmony, Kansas, my father began stretching old fishing net and worn wagon canvas on tall poles over his best 10 acres of wheat, and the whole county decided that grief had finally turned his mind. My mother had been 2 years in the ground by then. He was raising 3 of us alone, and a man alone with children is watched in a small town the way you watch a pot that might boil over. And when that man starts building what looked for all the world like a great ragged tent over a field of green wheat, the watching turns to talk, and the talk turns unkind. My name is Hattie Mercer, and I was 9 years old that spring, and I want to tell you a story that does not end the way most of the hard weather stories end. Most of them, the ones I have heard all my long life, end with the stubborn man proved right, and the town made sorry, and everybody a little colder for it. Mine does not. Mine ends warm, and I have waited a long time to tell one that does. You have to understand what a hailstorm was to a wheat farmer in that country, because unless you do, my father just looks like a madman with fishnet, and he was not. He was the sanest man I ever knew. On the high plains of Kansas, the whole year came down to a few weeks in early summer, when the wheat stood tall and heavy and gold and ready. And in those same few weeks, the sky bred the hail. A hailstorm is not like a drought or a hard winter that comes on slow and gives a man time. It comes in 20 minutes on a summer afternoon out of a green-black sky, and it can take a field of wheat that is a whole year's work and a whole year's bread and beat it flat into the mud, every head, in less time than it takes to eat your dinner. And then the sun comes out and the birds sing, and your children do not eat that winter. My father had lost a crop to hail the year my mother was dying. He had stood at her bedside and out at his flattened field in the same week, and something in him had set itself after that against ever standing helpless in front of the sky again. By July, the county would have its answer about my father's tent. By harvest, half of Harmony would be asking him, quiet and humble, how a man might build one of his own. The talk started, the way it did in Harmony, at the grain elevator, where the men gathered and weighed each other's business along with the wheat. My father, Amos Mercer, was not a big farmer or a loud one. He had a half section and 3 motherless children, and a reputation before that spring as a steady, quiet man who paid his debts and kept to himself, and had been dealt a hard hand with grace. That reputation was why the tent hurt so much, because it gave the town license to turn its pity into laughter, and pity that has been waiting to laugh is the cruelest kind. The man who laughed loudest was our neighbor, a big, prosperous wheat farmer named Del Puckett, who farmed the section next to ours and had never in his life lost a crop he could not afford to lose. Puckett was not a bad man. I want that understood from the start, because he matters to the end of this, and the end is the whole reason I am telling it. He was a loud man and a certain man, the kind who has done well and credits it entirely to his own good sense. And he looked at my widowed father spending his last money on fishnet and canvas, and he could not resist the target. He stood at the elevator and told the men that Mercer had given up farming to go fishing for wheat, and asked what bait you used to catch a bushel, and the elevator laughed, and the name he hung on it that day stuck to us for months. Mercer's Cobweb. They called our field Mercer's Cobweb, and my brothers came home from school with the name thrown at them, and I saw my father's jaw go tight when he heard it, but he never once answered it, because he had no time. He was working against the calendar, and the calendar was the sky. The church talk was gentler and landed heavier because it came wrapped in concern for us children. Poor Mercer, they said, alone with those little ones. The loss has unsettled him. Someone ought to speak to him before he ruins what he has left. The preacher's wife brought us a pie and stayed to look out the window at the field, with an expression I understood even at 9, and my father thanked her for the pie and did not explain himself, and when she was gone he went back out to his poles. A man who will not explain himself gives a town nothing to do but invent his reasons, and Harmony invented freely. But I knew why, because I was his shadow that spring, and I want to tell you the thing that lived in our house, and then I will let it lie. On the shelf over the stove, where another family might keep a clock, my father kept a canning jar, and in the jar, dry and brown and worthless, was a single head of wheat. It was from the crop the hail had killed the year my mother died, the one head he had picked up out of the ruined mud and carried inside. He never said a word about it, all the years it sat there, and none of us children ever dared touch it. I understand it now, the way I did not then. It was not a keepsake of the crop. It was a promise he had made to himself in the worst week of his life, standing between a dying wife and a killed field, that he would find a way, that he would not be made helpless again. And the jar sat on the shelf where he could see it every morning and be held to his word. The idea itself was not something he dreamed up whole, and my father would have been the first to say so. He had read of it in the farm papers he took and studied by lamp after we were abed, and he had thought it through and changed it to fit what a poor man could get his hands on. Truck gardeners back east stretched cloth and netting over their tender early crops to save them from late frost and pounding rain, and orchard men hung screens over prize trees, and the notion of a shield between the sky and the growing thing was old and sound, and written down for anyone who would read instead of laugh. What was strange was not the idea. What was strange was a wheat farmer on the open plains doing it over a field, at scale, with fishnet and wagon sheets and cast-off canvas, because a rich man could have bought proper cloth, and a poor man had to make do. And making do is what looks like madness to people who have never had to. He explained it to me once, because I asked, and because I was the only one who would rather understand him than mock him. He was setting a pole, and I asked him why the net would stop the hail when it had holes in it you could put your fist through. And he said, "Hattie, I am not trying to catch the hail." He tightened the guy line. "I am trying to make it let go before it lands." I did not understand him, and he saw it, and he tried again in words a child could hold. "The net takes the fall out of it," he said. "A stone that would break the wheat only bounces off the wheat, if something up above has already caught it once and slowed it down." And that I understood, and I have never forgotten it, because it turned out to be the whole of the thing. The first trial came in May, and it went against him, and it gave Del Puckett the best week of the whole spring. My father's first rigging was too flat and too tight. He had stretched the net level, like a ceiling, drawn drum-tight over the poles, and the first ordinary rainstorm of May came, and the water pooled in the flat net and grew heavy, and the whole rigging sagged, and then tore loose at one end, and came down draped over the wheat in a sodden ruin. And my father spent 2 days untangling wet net from bent green wheat, while Puckett told the elevator that Mercer's cobweb had caught its first big fish, which was Mercer's own field. It was funny. Even I could see it was funny, and I loved him. And it was the best thing that could have happened, though none of us knew it, because my father sat up that night with his lamp and his farm papers and figured out exactly why it had failed. He did not build it flat again. He built it in peaks, this time pitched like the roof of a barn, so the rain and the hail would strike a slope and roll off it into the rows between the poles, instead of pooling on a flat. And he left the netting looser, with give in it, because he had understood something in the night that changed everything. A tight net breaks, a loose net gives, and a thing that gives takes the force out of what hits it, the way a man catches an egg by drawing his hands back with it instead of slapping them shut. He rebuilt the whole 10 acres in pitched, slack panels, and it cost him a week he could barely spare, and it was the week that turned a fool's tent into a machine that would work. By June, the rigging stood finished over the best 10 acres, the seed wheat, the ground he could not afford to lose. And I will tell you honestly what it looked like, because I heard every word the town said, and some of the words were mine before I knew better. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a patchwork of old net and grey canvas and mismatched wagon sheets pitched on a forest of crooked poles over a field, sagging here and taut there, flapping at the edges in the wind, the poorest, rattiest, most makeshift thing you ever saw, stretched over the greenest, finest 10 acres of wheat in the county. Set against Puckett's clean, open, golden sections rolling to the horizon, proud and unguarded and beautiful, My father's shrouded little field looked like exactly what they called it, a cobweb, a widower's sad delusion, a monument to a grief that had come untethered from sense. And the sky over all of it, all that June, was high and blue and innocent. The sky was not innocent. The sky was loading, the way it does over Kansas in early summer, and my father read it the way the town could not, or would not. The signs were there for anyone who farmed by the sky instead of the calendar, and my father had farmed by the sky since he was a boy. The mornings came too still and too warm and too heavy, one after another, the air thick as wet wool by noon. The cattle grew restless in the afternoons and bunched in the low corners of the pastures. Great white thunderheads built in the west every day, taller each day, their tops sheared flat and mean, and some afternoons you could smell it coming. A green, wet metal smell on the wind that the old people called the smell of hail. My father watched the west every evening from the edge of his shrouded field and checked his guy lines and said little, and I stood beside him and watched him watch the sky, and I was not afraid because he was not, and a child takes her weather from her father's face. Something was building in the western sky that was going to answer every joke that had been told at our expense, and my father knew it, and he was ready, and the town was not. There was one thing more he did in the last week of June, and even I thought it was strange, and it turned out to matter as much as all the net. He walked the whole rigging, and he loosened every panel a little more, on purpose, until they hung with a real slack belly in them, so slack that Puckett, riding past, called over the fence to ask if he had given up and was taking it down. My father said no. He said he was making it lazier. And Puckett rode off shaking his head, and my father said to me, "Quiet. The tighter it is, the more it fights the hail, and the more it fights, the sooner it tears. It has to be lazy enough to catch and let go, all afternoon, and never once fight." I have thought about that a great many times in the long years since, about all the things in a life that only survive the blow because they have learned to be lazy enough to give with it and never fight it head on. The storm came on the 9th of July, 1892, in the middle of the afternoon, and I remember every minute of it, because it was the day I watched my father stop being the town fool and start being the man they came to for advice, though he never once acted as if anything about him had changed. It had been the stillest, heaviest morning of them all. By noon the air would not move, and the chickens went to roost in the daylight, and my father came in from the field and stood in the doorway looking west, and I saw his face, and I put down my sewing. Out on the far edge of the sky a wall was building, and it was not white any more. It was green, a bruised, sick green, shading to black underneath, and it climbed as we watched it, and it came on toward Harmony with a strange, sideways roll to it, and under the black belly of it hung a paler curtain that I did not know yet was hail already falling miles away. My father said one word. He said, "Now," and he did not run to the field. He had done all his running in April and May and June. He gathered us 3 children into the house, and he stood at the window with his hand on my shoulder, and he watched his year and his promise and his children's bread go up against the sky, and he did not say anything at all. The storm did not care whose field it crossed, or who in Harmony had laughed. It hit Puckett's section first, because Puckett lay to the west of us, and I saw it hit, and I will never forget it as long as I live. The hail came into his golden wheat like a scythe made of the sky. It came white and roaring. Stones, the papers later said, were big as hen's eggs, some big as a fist, and where it passed there was a sound like the world being threshed, and Del Puckett's beautiful, open, unguarded sections, the finest wheat in the county, proud and golden and rolling to the horizon, went down, went flat. In the time it takes to tell it, a whole year of that proud man's work was beaten into the black mud. Every head, every stalk, and the hail did not slow or care, and then it came on, across the line fence, toward us. And it hit my father's ragged cobweb, and the cobweb held. I was watching through the window, with his hand on my shoulder, and I saw it. And even at 9 years old, I understood that I was seeing something the town would talk about for 50 years. The hailstones came down on the pitched slack panels of old net and canvas, and they did not punch through, and they did not flatten the wheat, because the wheat was not what they struck. They struck the lazy net first, and the net gave under them, sagged and bellied down with the blow, and sprang back, and the stones lost their killing speed against that give, and rolled and bounced down the pitched slopes into the muddy lanes between the poles, where they lay and did no harm. Some panels tore. I will not tell you it was perfect, because my father would call me a liar from his grave. 2 or 3 of the old wagon sheets split under the worst of it, and let some hail through, and that corner of the wheat was bruised and beaten. But the net panels, the lazy pitched net panels he had figured out by lamplight after his failures, those held, and under them 10 acres of the finest seed wheat in Kansas stood up green and living in the middle of a county that had just been beaten to the ground. The storm passed in 20 minutes, the way they do. The sun came out, the birds sang, the way they cruelly do. And Harmony came out of its cellars and its houses to look at a year's work destroyed, section after section. The whole county's wheat laid flat and black and finished under a sky gone innocent and blue again, as far as the eye could see in every direction. Except for one place. Except for one ragged, patched, ridiculous, shining wet 10 acres behind our house, where the wheat still stood, under a torn and sagging net that had just done the one thing every soul in Harmony had sworn it could never do. I promised I would make the sense of it plain, and here it is, and it is so simple that the simplicity is the marvel of it. Hail does not kill wheat by being cold or by being ice. It kills by speed. A hailstone falls from a great height, and it is moving terribly fast when it arrives, and it is that speed, that force, striking the ripe, heavy head of grain, that shatters the head and breaks the stalk and destroys the crop in an instant. Take the speed away, and a hailstone is only a lump of ice that melts in the sun and waters the field. My father had not tried to build a roof strong enough to stop the hail, because no poor man could build such a roof, and he knew it. He had built something better and humbler. He had built a thing that would catch each stone just once, high up, and slow it, and let it go, so that by the time it reached the wheat it was falling gently and could do no harm. The holes in the net that Puckett laughed at did not matter, because a stone that has been caught and slowed by the net drops soft even if it drops through a hole. It was never about stopping the hail. It was about taking the fall out of it, exactly as he had told me in the spring, when I was too small to know I was being handed the truth. Mind, it was not magic, and my father spent the rest of his life correcting anyone who told it as if it were. It saved the 10 acres he could reach, not the whole farm. The rest of his wheat, the open acres he had no net for, went down with everyone else's. The rigging was ruined and had to be half rebuilt for the next year. It was labour no rich farmer would ever bother with, back-breaking and endless, cheap only because our own hands were free. It worked on his 10 most precious acres, and it could not have covered a whole section, and he never claimed it could. But on the ground that held his seed wheat, the ground that meant his children would eat and plant again, it worked completely, and that was all he had ever asked of it. Now I come to the part I have been wanting to tell you the whole way, the part that makes this story different from the cold ones, and it starts with Del Puckett walking across the line fence the very next morning. He came on foot through the mud, past his own ruined sections, and he was not a man who had ever in his life walked humbly anywhere, and he walked humbly that morning. My father saw him coming and set down his tools and waited, and I hung back by the barn to watch, because even at 9 I knew something was about to happen between 2 grown men that did not happen often. Puckett stopped at the edge of our standing wheat, and he took off his hat, and he looked at that green living field under its torn net for a long moment, And then he looked at my father, and he did the hardest thing I ever saw a proud man do. He said it out loud, and he said it plain, with no excuse hung on the end of it. He said, "Amos, I called you a fool in front of the whole county, and you were the only man in it with the sense to be ready. I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I have come to ask you to teach me how you did it." And my father, who could have had his month of triumph right there, who had earned the right to remember every joke and hand a few of them back, did not. I watched him. He stepped over and he put his hand out and he took Del Puckett's hand. And he said the thing that told me, more than anything in my whole childhood, what kind of man had raised me. He said, "Del, you lost your crop and I did not. And there is no wisdom in me that a dead wife and a killed field did not beat into me the hard way. I would not wish my teacher on any man. Come in out of the mud and I will tell you everything I know." And he took his enemy into our kitchen and gave him coffee and drew him pictures of the pitched panels on the back of a seed catalog. And by the time Puckett went home, they were not a mocker and a fool anymore. They were two farmers, and then, over the years that followed, they were friends, the best either of them had. And that is the part Harmony never tells when it tells the story. And it is the only part that ever mattered to me. The word went around the county fast after that, the way praise travels slower than mockery, but travels surer. By the next spring, there were pitched net panels going up over seed ground on farms all across Harmony, and my father did not charge a soul for what he knew. He walked their fields with them and helped them figure the poles and the slack. And Del Puckett, who had money where my father had none, bought good proper netting and had the grace to credit Amos Mercer at every elevator gathering for the rest of his life, and to shut down hard on any new man who tried to laugh at the rigs the way he once had. A mocker turned advocate is the fiercest friend a good idea ever has. The name changed, the way names do. Nobody said Mercer's cobweb anymore, or if they did, they said it warmly, the way you say a family joke. They said the hail nets, a plain name for a plain good thing. And within a few years, a stranger driving through Harmony in early summer would have seen them pitched over seed ground on half the farms in the township, and never known that the first one had been a widower's madness that a whole town had laughed at. I am an old woman now, older than my father was that summer, older than he lived to be. And I have told you this story because it is the one I most wanted to be true, and it happens also to be the one that is. My father lived a long time after that July. He saw all three of us grown and married and safe, and he saw his hail nets become just a thing that farmers did, and he saw his worst enemy become the man who carried his coffin, and he was thanked in his own lifetime out loud by the very people who had mocked him, which is a thing that almost never happens in the hard stories, and happened in ours. The dry brown head of wheat stayed in its jar on the shelf over the stove until the day he died, and I have it still, on my own shelf, brown and worthless and beyond all price, because I know now what it was. It was a promise a broken man made to himself that he would not be helpless, and it is the only inheritance I ever wanted. People ask me, when I tell them my father saved his crop from the great hail of '92 with Fishnet, how he knew it would work. And I tell them he did not know. He hoped, and he prepared, and he was humble enough to fail 3 times in front of a laughing town and build it better each time. And that is not the same as knowing, and it is worth more. You cannot stop the hail. No one can stop the hail. But you can take the fool out of it if you are willing to look foolish long enough to learn how. And my father was, and it saved us. And I have eaten bread every winter of my life from the seed that stood green under his ragged, lazy, beautiful net. Now, the family in this story is ours, but here is what is true. Hail was and remains one of the most feared destroyers of grain on the high plains, capable of flattening a ripe wheat crop in minutes on a summer afternoon. And it takes the crop by the speed and force of the falling ice, not by cold. Growers really did, and still do, protect high-value crops with overhead netting and screens. Hail netting is standard today over orchards and vineyards, and it works exactly on the principle in this story by intercepting and slowing the stones before they strike, with given the net to absorb the blow rather than resist it. Truck gardeners and orchardists of the 1800s used cloth and netting against frost, rain and hail, and the idea was available in the farm press of the day to any reader who sought it. Covering a whole field of wheat this way was never practical at scale, then or now, but over a small and precious plot, the physics is sound and the protection is real. The people and the town of Harmony are imagined. The hail, and the humble old trick of taking the fall out of it, are exactly as they are.